For decades, the United States treated one Middle Eastern nuclear power like it doesn't exist. Not Iran, not Russia, but Israel. It's a very secret deal that was formed at the very top level of the United States government. And recently discovered documents that were released last year shed light on the relationship between the United States and Israel's nuclear weapons program. It wasn't until the past couple years where people felt open and comfortable enough about even bringing up Israel's nuclear weapons, and Israeli officials still refuse to admit that they have any. For example, take a listen to this previous recording with an Israeli diplomat when directly asked about Israel's nuclear weapons program.
How many nuclear weapons does Israel have? Because experts say it's anywhere between 80 and 400.
So what?
So what?
Yeah, so what?
So there you have it. They refuse to admit. And the first president that really forged this relationship with Israel of nuclear ambiguity, where you will have the bomb and we're not going to share with the world that you have a nuclear weapon, was actually President Nixon. This was back in 1969, once Israel had developed or was very close to developing the nuclear bomb. Richard Nixon was in conversation with Israeli officials regarding how to go about Israel's nuclear ambiguity. So this was really led by the U.S. former United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and this document was released last year. It's a pretty shocking document, and it's the sanitized copy, and it was sent in 1969 from Henry Kissinger to President Nixon. And in the document, it talks about the immediate concern and problem at stake, which is the fact that Israel is very close to developing the nuclear weapon, and the United States doesn't know how to go about it. So here's what the document really says to distill it down. And they directly outline it. Henry Kissinger states, "The dilemma we face. Our problem is that Israel will not take us seriously on the nuclear issue unless they believe we are prepared to withhold something very much needed, the Phantoms, or even more, their wholly military supply relationship with us. On the other hand, if we withhold the Phantoms, and they make this fact public in the White House, enormous political pressure will be mounted on us. We will be in an indefensible position. We cannot state why we are withholding the planes. Yet, if we explain our position publicly, we will be the ones to make Israel's possession of nuclear weapons public with all of the international consequences that entails." Now, of course, the United States had a lot of reasons why it didn't want the world to know that Israel has nuclear weapons, and the document also outlines those reasons directly. So here's what different heads of government at the time felt were their primary concerns when it came to Israel's nuclear weapons development that was listed in this top secret memo. The Joint Chief of Staff stated they felt that if Israel's program became known, we should be in possession to say that we did everything in our power to prevent Israel from going nuclear. JCS felt that we should try to stop Israel's missile production and use the Phantoms as leverage, the planes that the United States was selling to Israel at the time. The defense sector felt that we could live with the existence of the Israeli nuclear weapons provided that they were not deployed. Defense agreed that we should try to stop missile production and that we should use the Phantoms as leverage to get the assurances that we needed, while the State Department believed that we should try to keep Israel from going any further with its nuclear weapons program. It may be too close to completion that Israel would be willing to make record for ourselves of having tried. State has joined in suggesting asking the Israelis to halt production of the missiles and to approach the Israelis, but be prepared to imply that the threat, if they were unresponsive, would to be our first approach. So what's really going on here, and this is already past the point where Israel has the nuclear radioactive material. It's very close to developing the bomb. And now Nixon is basically going about how to handle the fact that there will soon be a nuclear Israel. This is right in 1969. John F. Kennedy is already assassinated. And for those who don't know the general timeline, John F. Kennedy was fighting furiously with Israel's prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, and then Levi Eshkol to stop Israel from developing nuclear weapons. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. During Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, that pressure was very much so lifted. very much so lifted, and Israel was still in the process of developing the nuke. By Nixon's presidency, Israel had came very close to completion, completed the development of the nuclear weapon, and now Nixon is faced with being the first president to live in a world where there is a nuclear armed Israel. That's how we got to where we are by this point in history. So then the document goes on, and it says, Henry Kissinger states, I recommend the first. I would propose that Richardson and Packard call in Rabin and go through the first step as outlined in their paper, express our desire to tie up loose ends on Israel's nuclear assurances, but not explicitly link the delivery of the planes to their reply. So this entire document is just figuring out, and they're really just being politically correct here and figuring out how to navigate the situation with the Israelis. Should we sell them the plane? Should we not sell them the plane until they promise us they're not going to fully develop it? But by this point, they were going to develop it either way. They had the missiles they needed from France. France gave them the missiles, and the nuclear warhead would go onto the missile. They already possessed the missile by that point. So really, it came down to just weeks away. So the idea that they were going to be able to stop Israel from having the nuke ready to go was ridiculous at the time. They knew it was, and they were figuring out how to go about it. So the next documents show here the rationale to the approach is that it raises the question with the Israelis before delivery of the Phantom becomes an active issue. We shall have to find an excuse for not delivering in August, but the scheduled delivery would begin in September. And they're basically explaining the rationale as to why they should act in the manner that they do, which might be a process of nuclear ambiguity. So, what did Nixon decide to do, and how did they decide to go about it? Well, Israel's first female prime minister, Golda Meir, she was the one that was in office during the time that Nixon was going back and forth. And they called it the Nixon-Meir agreement, which was basically this agreement of nuclear ambiguity that we have until today, where no president will ever mention the fact that Israel is a nuclear armed nation and will be just there will be a relationship of ambiguity where people know, but we don't have our elected officials share it. And this is really the president that forged that policy of nuclear ambiguity. Okay, so when did this really happen? Well, it's believed that this conversation, this internal conversation between the two leaders of the countries, started when Golda Meir actually came to the United States, and she met with Richard Nixon. This was Nixon's daily diary at the time, listing his scheduled agenda, where he met with the prime minister of Israel to discuss this. And here's just a short clip of when they first met. She came to the White House lawn. They said hello. They had an entire military presentation for her to see.
Madam Prime Minister, and our guests here at the White House today, it is a very great privilege for me, speaking in behalf of the American people, to welcome you, Madam Prime Minister, in a very personal sense, because you were born in this country, you have been to this country many times, but we are particularly proud that for the first time we welcome you as the Prime Minister of Israel.
So there you have it, and it's believed that during this conversation that this policy of nuclear ambiguity really came to be, and this is what really forged it. And the pressure on Israel to develop, the pressure on Israel to be public about or to stop the development of the nuclear bomb by this point it's been too late. And now the president is figuring out how our future presidents of the United States of America going to live with a nuclear armed Israel. So they go back and forth, of course, and there's dialogue because they're still selling the planes at the time to Israel, and there's dialogue of, okay, well, we want to make sure the United States has some sort of leverage, gets some sort of assurances from the Israelis regarding their nuclear weapons. So these assurances came in the form of Rabin at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, who was previously also who was also going to be a prime minister of Israel in the future. And he was still working as a head of the IDF or a top military official. And he sent a memo to the United States, which I also have that I'm about to share, where he lists the assurances that Israel is going to provide to the United States now that they're a nuclear armed nation. And they're going to talk specifically about what it means to be in possession of nuclear weapons. So let me go ahead and share my screen one more time here and show you this document. So this document, let me go ahead and do a screen share for you guys. Let's see here. 1 second, guys. There we go. Alrighty. So this document that I just got popped up on my screen is the memorandum from the president's assistant to the National Security Affairs, Kissinger, to President Nixon. Okay, and this is kind of the assurances that they're talking about here. Rabin's proposed assurances on Israeli nuclear policy. Ambassador Rabin has asked whether the following replies to our queries about Israeli nuclear policy would be satisfactory. Israel will not become a nuclear power. Number one, Israel will not deploy strategic missiles until 1972. Number two, the new Israeli government after the October 28th election will consider the non-nuclear proliferation treaty. Here's what's so interesting about this assurance the Rabin provided. Okay, when they state the word Israel will not become a nuclear power, quote unquote, what does nuclear power actually mean? Well, they went ahead and defined it. Our July request, the Israelis had promised in signing the contract for the planes not to be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Rabin had informally defined introduce, quote unquote, to mean not to test and not publicize. So when they say not to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East, what this assurance that is being provided states that Israel is like, okay, we don't have a nuke. We'll just say we're not going to test and not publicize it. And if we don't test and publicize it, that means we're not introducing it. That's how they went about their definition. So really, this is all political lingo. They're just going back and forth to try to write out formalities. It was all writing out formalities to have things on paper, to do what's necessary and what's politically correct as a government official to do, send the memos back and forth, have things written on paper so future presidents can see how we got from where we are to how we got to where we are today. And it was just a lot of formalities going about technical definitions, not actually addressing the real concerns that there are at stake now that we have a nuclear armed Israel out in the open, going about the world. That's it. It's solidified that Israel is now nuclear armed. Okay. So the papers from which you worked in authorizing define possess for our own internal purposes as, quote, Israeli activity short of assembly of a completed nuclear explosive device. In short, we tried to put ourselves in a position where we could act as if we assume the Israelis do not have completed weapons, while leaving to the Israelis conscious the stage short of completion where they would stop. Okay, so what's that really mean? Well, they go on of the implication of the Israeli response. Instead of accepting our words as, quote, not possess, Rabin simply says they, quote, prefer to say that they will not become a nuclear power. And nuclear power, in their phrase, of course, means they're just not going to publicize it. That's what they decided to do. They said, okay, well, we're going to say we don't possess nukes because we're not going to publicize it. And we're going to have the nuclear warhead and we're going to have the missile, but maybe we're just not going to screw it on. And because we didn't screw it on fully yet, it means that we don't have a fully assembled warhead, even though it's going to take maybe like a couple hours or whatever it takes to fully put the pieces together. But we have everything. And that's basically how they went about it. And the president of the United States, they realized that they were at a position where they couldn't stop it. Israel is nuclear armed. They can't stop it, and they have to figure out how to go about it. And Nixon kind of paved the way for a world in which Israel would be nuclear armed and how the United States would go about that nuclear ambiguity. So think about it. Why didn't the United States want Israel to have these to be public about their nuclear weapons? Well, because they were worried that if Israel was publicizing the fact that it was nuclear armed, then the Arab world was going to start aligning more with the Soviets, and the Soviet Union would start helping the Arab world become nuclear armed themselves. And the United States at the time was worried about nuclear proliferation. So it became just rationally from the United States perspective, they're like, okay, well, we don't want the Soviets to get too close to the Arabs. And we know that if the world knows that Israel's nuclear armed and we'd allowed it, or we were associated with it in any way, regardless, even if we were not associated with it, the Arab world now is going to figure out how they could stay safe. And we don't want the Arabs to start aligning with the Soviets and develop their nuclear arms. So we're just not going to tell anybody. And if we don't tell anybody, then the Arabs aren't going to be racing for the nuke. And it made logical sense. From the US perspective, it made logical sense because they didn't want the Arabs to get too aligned with the Soviets, and they thought that they could still be equal players. But by that point, it was too long gone. It was all done. By that point, Lyndon B. Johnson forged the unremovable relationship between the United States and Israel. By that point, the Israel lobby became entrenched in U.S. politics. It already, not fully entrenched, but it already soaked its foots. The Israel lobby, AIPAC, was already formed by that point. Okay, so the Israel lobby, AIPAC, was formed. They don't need to register as a foreign agent. That's already passed. John F. Kennedy was already assassinated. And Lyndon B. Johnson forged the way for the special U.S.-Israel relationship. The USS Liberty was bombed. Lyndon B. Johnson really didn't want the public to know too much about it. And so now we lived in a world where Israel won. You could say Israel won by that point. And when I say won, I mean Israel had already completed the necessary steps for a complete enroachment and entrenchment into the United States government and as a fifth column in the United States. The Israel lobby was already established without the necessity to register as a foreign agent. That's already done. Israel was nuclear armed. That's already done. Any administration that was in the way of Israel was out of the way by that point. John F. Kennedy, lucky for Israel, was assassinated. That's already done. Israel already began occupying the occupied West Bank. That's already done because of the 1967 war, which wouldn't have happened had John F. Kennedy been alive, because John F. Kennedy wouldn't have allowed Israel wouldn't have supplied Israel with the weapons it needed for even that war to continue. And that war wouldn't have happened because the Arabs wouldn't have wanted war with Israel to begin with if the Palestinians had the right of return, which John F. Kennedy was pushing for at the United Nations by putting forward a UN resolution that, of course, the Lyndon B. Johnson administration also completely just cut out and pulled back. They just pulled it. So Israel already established itself in the United States government. It enroached itself into U.S. foreign policy, and that's it. I would say that by Nixon's presidency, Israel had its foothold in the United States. I'd say that John F. Kennedy's assassination is what was basically the defining moment that split history in two different paths. And by Nixon, Israel had every single necessary aspect of its fifth column in place in the United States to do what it does. And nowadays, we're a bit more open about Israel's nuclear power. When I say we are, the public is, and we only had one U.S. official still come out and talk about it, which is Marjorie Taylor Greene, who resigned, and she's not going to be in Congress for the upcoming post midterms. So she was the only, which is why it was so big. If you remember, when Marjorie Taylor Greene went out openly and said that Israel is a nuclear armed nation, might not have seemed like such a big deal to you, but for a U.S. official to say that at the time, Israel is a nuclear armed nation, that was massive, because no U.S. official prior to that had the courage to say what she did, which is that Israel was nuclear armed, because it was well spoken within DC, within the Hill, within the Congress, that you just don't mention Israel's nuclear weapons. Because then you're going about the fact, well, wait a second, we are supporting a country that's nuclear armed, that's not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. How is that allowed? What? And it would violate a lot of US law, so we just don't even bring it up. We don't bring it up. So that's how we got to where we're at today, guys. That's how we did it. If you found this video interesting, would really appreciate the support. Super gifts and chats help me do these videos for you guys as a full-time job. And if you click the subscribe button as well, it helps me reach more awesome people like you. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if there's any other videos you guys want me to do in the future, send me some links as well to documents you guys find interesting. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Bye.